I'll go ahead and get started. First, I just want to thank you all, and it's a privilege to join you all this evening and just share some of my thoughts. And I think I owe Rose and Bree some help and thanks in terms of getting the PowerPoint. They're going to help move the slides forward so I don't have to multitask. And so I thank you for doing that. And so I'll just say next slide when I ask you to move forward. Although you need to, yeah, there we go. No, back. There we go. All right. So, so when I was thinking about what we could dialogue about tonight, with the many of us with a shared history with cancer and with all the threat of COVID in the last several years, and with the backdrop of the 25th anniversary of the project, it occurred to me that the one topic that we could all embrace would be thrivership. From the very conception of the project, with all its grassroots passion to this very moment of tonight's open circle, the project's mission has been to provide opportunity for each one of us to thrive through connection to ourself, our family and friends, and our community. And though we'll be speaking of thrivership within the context of cancer, now that the world has felt their life and livelihood threatened by the COVID pandemic, others, I think, have awoken to similar new self-awareness. So the dictionary defines thrive as to grow, to flourish, to do well in a situation in which you are given, often from something that's been very difficult or unpleasant. These days, we hear the word resilience commonly used, and I think that partially captures the meaning of thrivership. But I see thrivership more as a journey, a process, and an outcome, all wrapped into one. And I think that quote, ship, is often revisited and rebirthed in different times and circumstances. Next slide. Before we get started, I think it's important that we acknowledge and respect that not everyone wishes to use the term thrivership associated with their cancer experience. And indeed, the language around a cancer experience and for some a cancer-related identity has evolved over time, reflective of the historical attitude around cancer and most certainly influenced as the treatment of cancer improved. So I don't expect you to be able to read this table. It's very fine print, but I just was providing it more of kind of a historical point of view. In the past and still some today, cancer carries a stigma. Primarily due to its association with death. And this manifested in years and years and years ago in ways that decreased patients' willingness to even discuss it in cancer in public. Back then, they wouldn't even seek treatment. And the stigma even ran so deep that doctors wouldn't even share the patient's diagnosis of cancer with them. And then in the 1930s, actually, the American Cancer Society entered the scene to fight that fatalism and to educate the public about how surgery at that time could really be curative for cancer. And then the National Cancer Institute actually came on board in about 1930, starting to seek the cure for cancer with other modalities as well. And even in some of probably your lifetimes in the 1960s and 70s, there was still the debate about telling or not telling. My own grandmother failed to disclose her breast cancer until it had so advanced that she couldn't ignore it anymore. And she even had an odor coming from her chest wall because it had eroded. So she certainly fell into that category of not wanting to share. This is why it was actually such a big deal that Betty Ford, the wife of the President Gerald Ford, in 1975 opened up about her own breast cancer and how she underwent a mastectomy, declaring it made her no less a woman, because it certainly was perceived as that. Fortunately, at that time, also the feds mandated creating guidelines for informed consent, and so no longer could it be kept a secret from the patient. The ACS actually in the 1970s introduced the concept and term of cancer survivorship as treatments improved and more people survived the cancer diagnosis. Two, at this time, with good intent, they started looking at some of the psychological aftermath of a cancer diagnosis, but some of these studies actually led to exploring the psychosomatic causes of cancer, leading to some psychological blaming of the patient for their cancer. And even when I was diagnosed in the mid-90s, studies I came across promoted the whole concept of the cancer personality, and that we brought on that through who we were. This history led to a growing cancer community, and in particular, women with breast cancer who were very outspoken to develop organizations to push back on the stigma and the blame, and demand better treatments, and to take into account also the quality of life around cancer treatments. Studies weren't even started to look at that until the 90s. So in the late 1990s and early 2000, the cancer community actually embraced the word survivorship. The founding mothers of the project wanted to take it one step further with one of our cornerstones for the vision of the project, and we promoted healthy survivorship. But we, like other cancer organizations, began looking at the connotation of survivorship and how it emphasized cure, where our focus also encompassed healing. And with varying interpretations, this term could exclude those who were living with cancer, and if your cancer returned, had you failed survivorship? So there was a lot of questions around it. And so we and a lot of the other organizations began to use the word thrivership because it equated to healing, was less tied to a timeline of one's cancer journey, and thrivership could be seasonal, coming and going. And it let go that label of survivor, which focused on the disease outcome and rather focused on the person and the defining of their own cancer journey. Next slide. In defining your own thrivership, I'm wondering what words pop into your mind when you think about thrivership. These are some of the words that really popped into my mind's eye when I pondered the question, but I'm wondering what words popped into your mind. You can put them in the chat or just speak them in the heart, and we can certainly talk about some of it after the end of the presentation. And I'm going to expand on some of these words that I have here a little bit later. Next slide. So thrivership is like a fingerprint. It's unique to each one of us because it evolves out of our own authentic story. And it is what makes us uniquely whole. It's unique to our soul journey, our purpose, and we are all seekers of our own truth, our own meaning in this life and death. And because it's about connections, we each have our own unique support systems and relationships to others, to our community, to Mother Earth, and to our higher power. Thrivership is most commonly birthed through some adversity, as I mentioned previously, and not uncommonly tends to be full of rebirths and renewals just because of our own human nature. Next slide. As thrivership evolves out of our own authentic story, I can truly only speak to my thrivership. And not uncommonly, in telling of our own stories, examples of thrivership emerges that were simply lived moments at the time and weren't necessarily realized at the moment in terms of how they contributed to your healing and your thrivership. So I would like to share some of my story with you. As many of you are aware, in 1996, I was diagnosed with an aggressive infiltrating ductal breast carcinoma, which had metastasized to my lymph system. And when I was given this diagnosis of breast cancer, I was at the age of 36. And I was just finding myself in my comfort zone of my career. And I certainly had cared for women with breast cancer, and I watched my own grandmother with breast cancer, but I was not prepared for the personal journey this diagnosis initiated for me. It was fearful, sad, and it was a surreal time. It seemed as if my life slipped into this kind of alternate universe where time kind of warped and nothing made sense. And perhaps some of you can also have a sense of that for your own initial diagnoses. I asked questions of why. I went through the stages of grief and loss, and I actually chose to journal daily and use a reflective meditative process to try to make sense of it all. I underwent multiple surgeries, including a quadrilectomy, and while in the midst of the last of my 5 cycles of adriamycin-based chemotherapy, I developed a recurrence. and was told I had a 20% chance of survival because of the recurrence and my age uh, and just the aggressiveness of it. My oncologist literally used the word doomed when relaying my prognosis. And at that time, I truly experienced how powerful words can be that our medical providers choose to communicate with their patients and felt the emotions that they carry. And this was a very angry and devastating time for me. However, this did lead for a need for a mastectomy and is actually how I met Dr. Ellen Mahoney and the vision for the project. So, like many of you, when I was diagnosed, outside of being fatigued, I felt like I was a healthy person. And like many of you, I not only encountered the physical challenge of treatment, but also the mental and emotional challenge of continuously making crucial decisions about what therapy to pursue, as well as learning to live with this new reality called cancer with all its uncertainty. And I came to view it as a rite of passage for me, and I likened it to a myth of Inanna. Next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar with the myth, Inanna was the queen of heaven and earth, and she was called to the underworld to visit her alien sister, Erishkigal, queen of the underworld. Inanna mistakenly assumes she will descend through the underworld with ease. However, she finds out that her power and authority of the upper world has no bearing on how she's treated in the underworld. She passes through these 7 gates in her descent, and at each gate she must give up a part of herself until by the time she reaches her sister, she has lost all her riches and livelihood, and her body is described as a quote slab of meat hanging on a hook with a barren soul. Next slide. As a rite of passage, commencing my own journey with breast cancer, I felt thrown into the underworld, a world with new rules, responsibilities, and a different language. A world where there is a level and weightedness of decision making, which certainly affects your quality of life on the short term, possibly the long term, and perhaps whether you live or die. A world where there's no guarantees of a particular outcome. Each one of my own treatments and challenges served as another gate. As I descended, I passed through the gates and I lost parts of myself, my breast, my hair, my energy, some of my cognitive skills, my financial security, my persona, my illusion of being in control, my emotional defenses of denial and rationalization, and that false belief that there would always be a tomorrow, till I too found myself naked and beholding the bare essence of my soul. However, what I met at each gate beyond the apparent loss was that challenge of balancing resistance to my loss versus acceptance of my loss. And with each gate, I was better able to discern when it was time to fight and when it was time to let go. This was frightening, but I reframed my points of crisis to serve as opportunities for me to be creative with my illness, offering choice as opposed to necessarily feeling victimized. I was living that Chinese ideogram for crisis, which serves as representative crisis, but also means opportunity. Next slide. This stripping away made it possible for me to declutter and reach depths within myself that otherwise I might not have otherwise reached. When you're stripped of your illusions, masks, and roles, you eventually discover something which cannot be stripped away, which is indeed who you are. And so, in redefining myself, like Inanna, I ascended with a new understanding and empathy for the whole of myself. I experienced the absolute want for cure, but more importantly, the absolute need for healing in order to begin to live fully with less and less fear, discovering beyond grace lies comfort, mystery, and adventure. Next slide. Did it move? I don't think so.
I opened the chat and then that stopped moving. All right. Sorry, now it's moving. Okay, next slide.
There we go. Thank you. So many of my lessons I learned with breast cancer actually led to the evolution of my own open healing circles displayed here. In being diagnosed with breast cancer, I had to come to love myself again. After all, my body had abandoned me. Treatment challenged and stripped me of my perceived identity and essence. And at the center of my circle was the self, myself, and the need to find a new self care, which was a process and led to an unfolding of other components of my healing circle. In that path to self knowledge and confidence, in addition to loving myself, I had to regain a self trust in my own body. And when I thought I achieved that, it was challenged. And so I had to find a self loyalty that renewed my self love and self trust. And later on, of course, being human and forgetting the lessons I had learned, I needed self compassion and forgiveness, leading to an expansion of my circle of my self care. This fourfold path led to that rediscovery of my personal and higher spirit and my thrivership. And driven by my poor prognosis, I used this circle and this path as a guide in reaching out to others, expanding my circle and the focus with the same aspects learned. And what struck me most was that power of forgiveness of others and myself that provided that true cleansing of my heart and soul. Next slide. Another powerful aspect of my healing and thrivership was learning to refrain. And I actually learned this through the power of a gift of a vision. And one of my most powerful moments came from one of my most painful of times. As I mentioned already, my oncologist literally told me I was doomed and only had a 20% chance of surviving. And I felt devastated, fearful, alone. And I felt like that word doom was written across my forehead. Shortly after that, I was meditating and found myself standing before an imaginary mirror. And I looked into that imaginary mirror, and the word doom on my forehead was reflected back actually as the word mood. And that was a key turning point in my fight with my cancer. I realized the power of my attitude and how it might affect the course of my life or the course of my dying. At that moment, I realized what a big factor my attitude would play in my cancer journey. And for me, the only way out was through. And though my attitude might not lead to my long-term survival, I was determined to live my life fully engaged. And in facing my prognosis, I had to find that fear spot within and transform it to a grace spot. I had to draw upon my higher power and energy to discover that grace, mystery, and joy. And I came to realize the transcendence of healing from cure. Next slide. So let's distinguish cure versus healing. So cure is something we all want, no doubt. It's a successful medical treatment that removes all evidence of the disease and allows that person who previously had cancer to live as long as they would have if they hadn't gotten the diagnosis of cancer. So curing is an external medical process affecting outcome in which the disease disappears, while healing is an inner process through which a person becomes whole. It can take place at the physical level, an emotional level, a mental level, a spiritual level. And healing helps us move towards our higher power within or a deeper connection with nature or towards an inner peace and a sense of connectedness. Next slide. Though cure and healing are different, they're also intertwined. For someone to be cured, the physical healing power of our own bodies must be sufficient to mend ourselves. So when we have surgery or given chemo, our bodies seek physical healing in order to recuperate. Healing, however, goes beyond curing. It helps us become whole even though our body may be failing or cure is unachievable. As an inner process, it asks more from us. It requires a willingness to approach our illness as an intimate. It beckons our faith, beliefs, and imagination to unlock the mysteries of our own healing. And in return, it gives us energy and meaning, which helps us alleviate the suffering. In short, for me, it's transformative. And if you need an image, curing has that same effect as sewing wings on a caterpillar. It still isn't a butterfly. And one's body may be cured, but one's soul needs a metamorphosis in order for it to take flight again. Next slide. An integrative oncologist once said, cancer is most certainly a wake-up call, an opportunity to heal and evolve through illness. In this sense, it's possible for someone to be cured of a cancer through aggressive treatment, yet never heal or feel whole again. It's also possible for a treatment to fail to cure, yet for profound healing to take place on that psychospiritual level. The crisis of cancer is, in the end, a crisis of the self, a potentially transformative opportunity, a call from our environment and a way of life that change is needed. End of quote. And it's my experience that even those who are cured need healing in order to not live in fear of that next mammogram or that next oncology visit, and to live with that uncertainty and move forward with renewed hope and energy, and to learn to live and accept years later the sequela from the treatment choices we made at that time. So I posit that healing, unique to each one of us, is required to find that thrivership in our journey with cancer. And it's that creative fire of our imagination that mirrors our soul. And so for me, one of the largest opportunities of my thrivership was taking that fire, that passion to start the project, who with other founding mothers grew this grassroots organization whose most important tools were a listening heart and the helper's owned experience to embrace others to join our healing circle. Next slide. So your thrivership begins with your story and creating moments to unfold your self-awareness. So let's look at some ways and how you can participate in your own healing and thus thrivership. One of the best ways is journaling, and whether that's you have the time to capture your day's experience, including your feelings in a story chronicled format versus answering some questions just at the end of your day. This reflection time is uniquely practiced depending on your own environment, but commonly it's helpful to find a quiet space where you can sit in silence. If you can do this in the same place in the same time, then it helps make this kind of a sacred place and time just for you. Before you start to record your day, generally you sit for a few minutes just using your breath to become focused. And some people focus on the breath itself, but it's also helpful to focus on the space between each breath. So I'm going to have us take some breaths so we can practice this. So let's take a moment and go ahead and close your eyes. And then let's take some deep breaths together. And in your mind's eye, I want you to follow your breath, but really take notice of that brief moment of rest and peace from when your breath ends and the next breath begins. Notice this tiny natural space of stillness. And each time you arrive at that space, let yourself be present to it and surrender to its stillness. Once you find yourself centered, it's then that you can start reviewing your day. So you can go ahead and open your eyes, or you can keep them shut, whatever's comfortable for you. This process is recommended by many, and including Dr. Rachel Remen, who wrote Kitchen Table Wisdom, which some of you may have read, and there's copies in our library. And it's a process called keeping a heart journal. And some of you may be familiar with this. You become centered, and then you review your day backwards from the present moment you're in, back through your day to when you awoke in the morning. And recall events that occurred, conversations you may have had. And you're going to ask yourself 3 questions, and you review your day backwards 3 times to seek answers to those individual questions. So the first question is, what surprised me today? And when you come across anything that answers that question as you're reviewing your day, you stop your review and you write it down. And you don't need to write a lot about it. What's most important is actually the re-examination from the perspective of this question and not how much you write. And so you review your whole day with this question, and then you move on to the second question. What moved me or touched my heart today? And then you do the same process, reviewing the backwards and then jotting some things down. And then you move to the third question. What inspired me today? And again, review backwards and jot down the answers in your journal. And that completes the task for that day. And you can simply put your journal away for that until tomorrow, and then you repeat the process. And at the end of the week, sometimes it's really nice to go back and review your answers just to kind of reflect on your week. And when you begin this type of journaling, some people find it hard to discover anything to write down. And this actually is not uncommon at the beginning. But don't get discouraged. Keep doing it. And you can always, if you struggle, always try to look at people around you or the events that occurred as if you were a novelist or a journalist or maybe a poet. Look for stories in your day. And commonly with time, you start noticing actually the answers to these questions you ask yourself at the end of the day, at the time that they occur in the moment they're happening. And this leads to another process that helps with self-awareness, and that's called growing new eyes. Next slide. So growing or finding new eyes occurs as you focus on these three questions in your subconscious so that you become more present to the moment with all those four intelligences we all possess, our mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical intelligence. And so the three-question heart journal becomes like this biofeedback of our mind's eye and pulls us into the present moment of our living. And as Proust said, the voyage of discovery lies not in seeking new vistas, but in having new eyes. And similarly, this can occur with a gratitude practice. Next slide. So gratitude is a powerful tool that grows a new eye. It is intentional and it trains you to use attention and brings you to the present moment. And if needed, it can be that mental jujutsu that can immediately turn negative talk on its head if that's occurring in your thoughts. So here are several jujutsu gratitude moves. First, where you notice and name one gratitude in the moment and include why you're grateful. Or two, you can keep a gratitude journal, or you can have a gratitude cup where on a small piece of paper, you write down 2 or 3 words about that gratitude and you drop it into your cup. And then at the end of the week, several of the papers are pulled out and you can recollect those moments. And you can do this with your family or team at work. And I've had some people use it where they drop a penny or a coin into that cup. And it just kind of recollects the moments of gratitude that you've shared in those in that week that you've experienced. Next slide. And there's actually a lot of science on how gratitude actually enhances our physical and mental well-being, as well as those around you. And so the University of California, Berkeley has a web-based Greater Good magazine that's free, that shares science-based insights for a meaningful life. And I've shared here the web site page that actually speaks to the gratitude in their magazine, and also a second web page that links to what they call a happiness calendar, which is actually a day-to-day guide of tasks to well-being and helps you embrace all of you in each day. Next slide. And as I mentioned previously, self-compassion is a vital aspect to that unconditional love of ourselves. And it's something that requires a self-awareness and a practice to make a habit. That self-critic we all have can be loud in our heads, but can also be subtle when we're shaming ourselves. And so here I share with you some resources from Dr. Kristen Neff, who pioneered research around self-compassion and is considered one of the world's leading experts on it. And she discovered 3 core components to self-compassion and developed a practice called the self-compassion break that you can do anytime you feel stressed or in emotional pain. And first, be mindful of when your inner critic is shaming you. Rather, approach the situation without judgment and analysis, and notice what you're feeling. Name it, and acknowledge this hurts and is a moment of suffering. Second, remember you're not alone. Shit happens to all of us. This is part of every human path, whether obvious or not. We all suffer, and it's actually what connects us in the human race. And finally, be kind to yourself as you would treat a friend. State, I accept myself as I am. And here are some links to a self-compassion test, as well as a TED Talk that Dr. Neff does to distinguish self-esteem from self-compassion, and a link to self-compassion guides and exercises that she developed. Next slide. Other ways we can participate in our own healing are listed here and reflect some of my own experience. And I found that cancer and its treatment brought me more into that present moment. And it was an opportunity to grow new eyes with kind of an enlivening of my five senses and certainly my sixth sense as well. And to this day, vividly, I remember the morning after my first chemo treatment. And I had problems with vomiting all night after each of my chemo treatments. It occurred 4 hours exactly after I received chemo. In fact, my oncologist called me 4 hours exactly after my treatment, and I was vomiting in the toilet and could not answer the phone. But I proved to them that it was true. But I just remember after waking up after a pretty hard night after my first treatment, and I looked outside my window, and there was this red poppy just blooming, and it stood out in its brightest red glory, with just kind of the rest of nature glistening around it. And it just led me to smile and find a joy in that moment, and was such a comfort and a source of renewal. And just allowed me to feel like I could move forward regardless what the next chemo treatment brought. Um, Other ways to consider is using guided imagery to help create a flow of thought that you can see, hear, feel, smell, or taste. And I see guided imagery as a language of the arts, your emotion, and your deep inner self that can truly sense opportunity to reframe crisis into opportunity. And then there's movement, whether it's yoga, qigong, tai chi, or something with a meditative rhythm to it. It can be even be bicycling, where you can certainly have that meditative movement of your legs, or a meditative walk. It can get you out of your head and really let you rebuild trust in your body. There's reading or listening to an audiobook from maybe one of your favorite spiritual authors and letting its message or language relate to your current space and time. There's the using of the power myth with its symbolism, revealing one's own spiritual potential, where the self, yourself, becomes a hero to that moment. There's saying a mantra or affirmations. And then there's laughing. Seek out opportunities to laugh. Perhaps watching comedy programs and movies, or reading funny books, or even reaching out to your oh so funny women friends for a rousing ladies' night. Give yourself permission to change, letting go, whether it's forgiveness of yourself or a prior habit. And then, of course, there's always the support groups that the project and the varying services offers that I'm sure many of you are aware of and are partaking in. All that can help with healing and thrivership. And when needing to make a decision about one of your treatments, get educated, of course, and talk to others in your support group, and then seek out your inner guide within and find the answer that comes to you through that connection of your mind, body, and spirit, and not making that decision necessarily out of fear, but rather trusting your instincts. Next slide. I found the further you got away from the time of your diagnosis and treatment, and perhaps re-entering your life and career, or maybe you were still doing that with treatment, that sometimes you can lose focus, the intense focus that we often have on healing and thrivership as we're going through treatment. And so obviously we need to reinvigorate those things that we just looked at. But I also want to offer you a process that I came across in January this year. And for many of us, the end and beginning of the year is commonly a reflection point where many of us review the last year and then ponder how we're going to hope to have a better coming year. And so this reflection often leads to a checklist of New Year's resolutions. But if you choose to do a more earnest reflection, requiring perhaps a consciousness with your true self and the connection between your mind body, your mind spirit, and your body spirit, then such connections lead to your vitality, self-awareness, and provide that opportunity to find meaning in your thoughts and action. And it allows you to thrive instead of just surviving on autopilot. Next slide. So with your resolute to self-awareness, you change from the typical New Year's resolutions checklist, which can often be a to-dos list and doesn't necessarily align with your reality of current circumstances, and too often results in us not achieving them or reacting to life rather than creating it. So instead, use the grid shown here on the right, which is intended to be a living document that helps you identify your personal and professional goals you choose to achieve in the next 12 months. And it's different from a checklist because of its grid framework and the process you go through, because it does involve your mind heart, and it looks to capture the current relevance, and it helps you take the future of thriving. helps take you to the future of thriving. The grid's 4-quadrant structure forces you to look at all areas of your life and not just a list from top to bottom. Next slide. Let's see, is that the right slide? You want to go back one? Uh-oh. So let's see, go next, see what the next slide shows us. Here we go. So the grid comes from the book, The Get Productive Grid by Magdalena Bachmeyer. And she's a neuroscientist and an author and founder of the Make Time Count, which focuses on individuals to succeed and thrive at the same time. And it's a tool that helps you kind of find that sweet spot of work-life balance. And it helps create healthy boundaries and boost your confidence and gets in touch with your passions to help restore your personal thriving through both being and action. And it focuses on 4 domains: life, self-care, work, and career. So let's see what the next slide brings. Um, so so Bachmeyer basically takes you through a process to create a full year's grid. And for some, it's broken down into monthly grids. But you take a 12-month grid, you draw it on a paper, journal, or iPad, whatever's available to look at frequently. And if you're able to do it on an iPad, I consider you very talented. But you draw this horizontal and vertical line to create 4 quadrants. And the horizontal line delineates between your work and personal life, with your personal life goals being above the line and your work goals being below the line. Also on the horizontal line, you write in a time that you go home or transition from work to personal time. And I think this is even more important for some people that actually are working from home now, to find that delineation between moving in that way. The vertical line actually in the grid divides external from internal goals. And the internal goals you do look after your well-being. And those tend to re-energize ourselves. So which in the areas 2 and 4 on the grid's right here, versus areas 1 and 3 on the left are external projects and actions for yourself. And these tend to take more energy. So each area is important because the 2 and 4 areas actually are essential because they build your health and your vitality and build that internal core self-esteem and energy that add to that self-awareness and connection, and then allows us to achieve our external goals. So you start identifying key goals within the 4 quadrants of the grid, and these are called home bases. And they actually reflect your values. They denote someone or something important to you in that area. And the home base is not something you can do in one go, but rather it captures something or a thing that you can work towards that you value. So it's like a goalkeeper. So for example, in area 1, upper left in the grid, which is used to designate external goals in your personal life, your home bases might be people such as family, friend, and partner, or perhaps a home base event like a holiday, anniversary, or a special occasion like a wedding, or perhaps a personal external hobby like your garden or a home remodel. Area 2, which is in the upper right, is used to designate your internal goals for your personal well-being. And these are things that nurture you and renew your soul. So examples might be me time, fun, travel, fitness, and creativity. And then there's area 3 in the lower left, where the home bases are external goals in your work life. And certainly you can have projects here, or how you approach clients or fellow staff, or volunteering. And then area 4 is, which is lower right, our home bases, our internal goals to your professional well-being. And these are things that you help to develop or nourish your career. And whether it's your current career, or maybe you're working towards another career or retirement. So these home bases are unique to you, and you should start with your current circumstance and dreams. And once identified, you're ready to add specific tasks to the home bases in each of the quadrants. And for some, it might be obvious, like a kitchen renovation for area 1, or an exercise plan for area 2. But for others, and perhaps for more meaningful tasks, you need to do some reflection and visualizations to get in touch with your goals. So Rose, I'm going to have you actually go back there. Gotcha. So to fill in your grid, you seek out some clarity about you. And so this involves you using some imagination and again, that fusion of your heart and mind. And so you need to develop awareness and connection to that sort of environment and lifestyle you want to live in order to really feel it. And you seek out who you can call on for help as well as who can offer help to you. And then again, that balance between your heart and mind. And so Bachmeyer actually takes you through 3 exercises. And her book actually walks you through some visualizations and reflections that you connect with your inner genius. And so I've listed here the 3 exercises she recommends, but don't go into the details, but can just briefly outline them for you. So the first exercise involves using your mind's eye and visualizations to imagine and explore every sensory aspect of that individual space you need to thrive in. What does that look like? And this curiosity often leads to a checklist of the conditions you need to thrive in that visualized space. You end up developing some key characteristics for thriving and values that are identified for you. Second, you connect to yourself and others through generosity, where generosity is not only what's tangible things that you own or offer, but rather as a mindset. And again, with your mind's eye, you recall situations where your generosity made a difference for others you touched in your daily life, and then how to pay it forward simply in an ongoing way. And just as important, it's important for you to explore how you invite others in to help you. And the third exercise actually involves reviewing the last year and then the next 12 months, where you complete 13 phrases that Bachmeyer has created. And so for example, in the past 12 months, I took responsibility for, and you fill in a blank, or felt truly energized by, and your responses identify and recognize specific actions you're going to take to carry out these exercises. So let's go back and do a next slide. Okay, next slide. Let's see. Okay, so actually, whoops, that was the one I was just talking about, wasn't it? Okay, so next
sorry.
slide.
Go
Sorry.
forward one more.
There we go. Got it.
Okay.
Okay. So this is an example of a 12-month grid where you've added specific actions that you can achieve. You then start highlighting certain tasks that you feel like acting on first. So for example, in area 1, you might highlight starting a project together with your partner. Area 2, you decide to take a trip. Area 3, team building activity, etc. And in her book, she indicates if a task cannot be achieved simply, then you break it down into simpler steps. And that 12-month grid serves as a blueprint for a year. But for some, people do monthly grids to kind of guide your daily living in order to achieve goals. And she takes you through that stepwise process in her book. She points out that there's no right or wrong way to create your grid except for maintaining that 4-quadrant framework. All right, let's go to next slide and see what we got here. Okay, so here's some resources for the grid. And I've purchased a few copies of the paperback book for the project's library that I will share with Rose. And then the Kindle version is $10. So it's fairly affordable for some people. All right, next slide. All right, let's see where we go. So let's go next slide. So, oh, I'm sorry, Rose, go back one. Okay. What? Nope, there. So in closing, I want to remind us all, and all of us this in our Zoom room have so much capacity and talent for the healers within. And our imagination and creativity and intuition is remarkably loyal. It sits there just like that spring-fed lake waiting for you to dip into it and waiting for you to notice it. And wholeness can sometimes be a surprise, and yet wholeness is really never lost. It's only forgotten. Integrity rarely means that we add something new to ourselves. It's more an undoing than a doing. And it's about emergence and revelation and a letting go of some ways that maybe we defined ourselves that was too small. And it's just a recovery of those parts that perhaps were forgotten, or perhaps our culture has interfered with us remembering and making part of our daily living. And it's just finding that heart, that intuition, and that soul. Next slide. And so finally, I want to offer you a recipe for thrivership, hope, and healing. And so first, you take 1 part courage, 2 part tears of failure and doubt, 1 part deep listening, 1 part each of both silence and laughter, a dash of trust, a pinch of wonder and imagination, a heaping scoop of self-compassion, and infuse some self-love to flavor to your unique taste. In a separate bowl, mix together family, friends, and those who challenge you to be your best self, those who help you remember all parts of yourself. And slowly, to a larger pot, add a bay leaf, well, for whatever bay leaves do, and mix well so that that whole emerges from all its individual ingredients. And let it simmer for as long as you need, and commonly it's much longer than you realize or anticipate. Keep the heat at an even temperature, hot enough to cook throughout, but not so hot to burn the bottom. Can be served at room temperature, warm or even cold if necessary. Garnish with some hope. Serve alongside your favorite soft blanket, dog, cat, or other soft item. Make often, share with others unconditionally, and hold on to those leftovers. You'll need them after a long day that challenges your soul.